Ultra-processed foods do far more than simply taste good. They hijack neural pathways designed for survival, gradually reshaping how the brain interprets hunger, pleasure, and reward. When examining how different age groups respond to these foods, the picture turns even darker. The same engineered flavors and textures that create instant gratification also produce long-term neurobiological changes that make natural foods less appealing, weaken self-regulation, and intensify cravings over time. And because the brain changes across the lifespan, the degree of vulnerability shifts in ways that leave some groups disturbingly exposed. In teenagers, the risk is at its highest. Their brain's reward circuitry is extremely sensitive, with the nucleus accumbens responding more intensely to sugar, fat, salt, and novelty than in any other life stage. This means that the hyperpalatable quality of ultra-processed foods, carefully optimized combinations of sweetness, crunch, creaminess, and rapid energy release, produces exaggerated dopamine spikes. Teens get a bigger hit from these foods, and because their prefrontal cortex is still maturing, they lack the full capacity to inhibit impulses or evaluate long-term consequences. The result is a dangerous imbalance: reward pathways that are overpowered and self-control systems that are underdeveloped. Over time, repeated overstimulation can dull dopamine receptors, pushing teens to seek even more intense foods to achieve the same level of satisfaction. This is how early patterns of preference shift from natural foods toward highly processed ones, and how a subtle form of neural conditioning lays the groundwork for lifelong struggles with overeating. In young adults, the brain is more stable, but the vulnerability persists in a different form. Dopamine responses are still strong, especially under stress, sleep deprivation, and emotional instability, which are common in early adulthood. Ultra-processed foods become coping tools, offering quick comfort and predictable reward. Yet this reward is neural manipulation, not nourishment. Frequent overactivation of dopamine pathways reinforces habit loops. Stress triggers craving, craving triggers consumption, consumption triggers temporary relief followed by a crash, which triggers more craving. Young adults often underestimate the cumulative impact of the cycle because they may not see immediate consequences. But within the brain, reward circuitry becomes more sensitized to processed foods and less reactive to whole foods. This is not just preference, it is neural rewiring that edges closer to addictive behavior. Studies show that the patterns of activation in people who frequently consume ultra-processed foods resemble the neural signatures seen in substance dependence, including reduced activity in regions responsible for impulse control and decision-making. By middle age and older adulthood, the neural landscape shifts again, and in some ways becomes more precarious. Dopamine levels naturally decline with age, meaning it takes more stimulation to feel rewarded. Ultra-processed foods fill that void with their exaggerated sensory profiles, but the reward they generate becomes increasingly short-lived. Instead of true pleasure, the brain receives quick spikes followed by sharper drops, creating a cycle of seeking food not for enjoyment, but to avoid discomfort. Older adults may therefore find themselves overeating without fully understanding why the urge feels so strong. Meanwhile, the prefrontal cortex, which regulates self-control, gradually loses efficiency with age. This means individuals who never struggled with cravings in youth may suddenly find their defenses lowered. Add to this the fact that chronic exposure to hyperpalatable foods over decades may have already weakened the brain's natural reward responses, and middle age becomes a perfect entry point for compulsive eating patterns that feel biologically unavoidable. One of the most troubling aspects across all age groups is that ultra-processed foods exploit fundamental neural shortcuts. The brain evolved to reward high-calorie foods because they ensured survival during scarcity. But modern processing delivers a level of intensity, sweetness beyond what fruit can provide, saltiness beyond what natural foods contain, and textures optimized for rapid consumption that the brain is not equipped to handle. Every bite becomes a form of overstimulation. Over time, the dopamine system adapts by becoming less responsive, which means natural foods feel increasingly bland and unrewarding. This neural shift is subtle but dangerous. It changes the baseline of what pleasure in eating feels like, pushing people toward choices that harm their metabolic and emotional health. The warning that emerges is stark. Ultra-processed foods do not merely tempt, they condition. They reshape neural circuits that determine desire, satisfaction, impulse control, and even identity around food. Teens experience this through heightened sensitivity and weak braking systems. Young adults experience it through stress-driven loops that blur into dependency. Older adults experience it through declining dopamine and reduced self-regulation that leave them increasingly vulnerable to compulsive eating. In every case, the foods capitalize on age-specific weaknesses, shifting brain chemistry in ways that reinforce further consumption. Once these neural pathways adapt to constant overstimulation, returning to a diet based on whole foods becomes psychologically and biologically difficult. Cravings feel stronger than willpower. Pleasure feels harder to achieve. And the brain begins to mistake manufactured intensity for genuine nourishment. Understanding these mechanisms is not just academic. It is a warning about how decades of relying on ultra-processed foods can subtly but profoundly alter the very circuits that govern choice, satisfaction, and self-control.